Resident Evil 4 constituted a massive watershed for video games at the time, despite being the flagship of the Capcom 5 project and the only big economic success among the 5 exclusives first planned for the GameCube. Shinji Mikami, the game's director, does not consider it a horror game. His and his team's intention from the start was to create a much more action-packed game than the rest of the series, and it was precisely that change of direction that ensured its diffusion even among those who did not appreciate its predecessors, as well as inexorably bringing it to a plethora of other platforms. However, assuming that its success is solely due to more adrenaline-pumping mechanics would be a grave error. The team led by Mikami managed to create a video game so well thought out that it became the inspiring muse of the entire genre of third-party shooters. The most perplexing aspect: his innovations, combined with the tension generated by the difficult fights, led a large number of horror to take up concepts and ideas, which is not a small result considering Mikami recently stated that he held back a lot during his conception, trying to give priority to the producer in him rather than the creator. At the same time, it would be simplistic to reduce Resident Evil 4's novelties to just a close-up camera behind Leon, when the game still represents a perfect lesson in map design today, even without counting enemies with such spot-on behavioral and positioning routines as to have made many of the campaign's most agitated phases iconic. And yet, we're talking about a production that is now nearly 2 decades old, considered perfectible in various aspects even by its creator, especially when we consider the industry's many advances and some risky choices made during production. It appears that the plot was written in a matter of weeks, for example. However, the numerous opportunities for improvement have not prevented discussions about Capcom's decision to devote himself to the remake of Resident Evil 4. On the one hand, many historical fans went into jujube broth immediately after the announcement, more than ever eager to relive Leon's adventure in a new form. On the other hand, a fair share of fans turned up their noses, convinced that Resident Evil 4 didn't require who knows what intervention, or simply that there were games in the series that were much more in need of a similar operation, codename Veronica, the more obvious one. Someone has even theorized that the game was chosen to generate money with a relatively easy work, considering the little entity of the intervention required to modernize the original. The last point, it must be said, is true. Resident Evil is still a very solid and brilliant game that has lost very little of its charm, only that what Mikami said about possible improvements was certainly not unsubstantiated, and the fact that some of its features have aged poorly is undeniable, particularly in certain specific phases. As a result, we approached everything in the only way we thought possible, by playing the original title for the 100th time simultaneously with the remake campaign, allowing us to compare the two works with the maximum mental freshness. And we can see it coming. Despite an unexpected final letdown, Capcom's newborn emerged victorious from the confrontation. Of course, we'll go through what we've played in depth in our Resident Evil 4 review today. The Resident Evil series has always been difficult to pin down in terms of plot. It is undeniably a brand beloved by millions of gamers, and it has spawned a universe of extraordinary complexity throughout the years, as well as infinite conversations and hypotheses regularly advanced by fans. However, its original inspirations were not only horror classics, but also B-movies, and it is not uncommon to hear cheesy, if not completely insane, dialogues between the various chapters. Many fans appreciate the series' absurd balancing act, and Resident Evil 4 is a prime example of this trend, as it chooses to paint Leon in shades of 90s action hero, and in doing so offers some truly memorable dialogues for their obtuseness, despite an overall compelling underlying plot. However, the remakes have chosen a different narrative path, one that is more refined and serious, but not so far removed from the exaggerations of the original series that it completely betrays its roots. Capcom's latest remake is no exception, as the story of the good Leon S. Kennedy has been largely redone in order to be more coherent and sensible. To be fair, we adored the protagonist's catchphrases and some of the absurd sequences in the closing stages of the original campaign, but there's no doubt that Capcom's adjustments to the story saved the experience. Many of the most ridiculous events have been significantly reworked. Nearly every single character is infinitely better characterized as well as more present in the story, and what happens to Leon takes on a whole new meaning once the final bars are reached. And, as previously stated, the general rewrite does not sacrifice the spectacular madness of some iconic moments that were completely unnecessary to cut. It is pointless to analyze the problem further with undesirable spoilers, so we will simply state that, in our opinion, the work done on the plot is promoted with flying colors, as well as substantially higher than what has been seen in the other remakes. If this is the case, there is reason to be optimistic for the saga's continuance, and, who knows, maybe a reconstruction from scratch of the 5th and 6th chapters. Sailing on the wave of narrative, we believe it is good and right to move on to the game's structure, especially since the creation of a campaign with the same rendering as the original and without content cuts represents an indispensable fundamental for most fans following the half-disappointment of the Resident Evil 3 remake. We mentioned it in the introduction, but it bears repeating. The design of the maps and the meticulous positioning of the enemies are some of the main elements that make Resident Evil 4 a masterpiece, and while it is not difficult to repropose some unforgettable battles in a remake without major upheavals, such as the initial village, rendered to perfection, renewing the less successful ones requires considerable talent. It was difficult not to be surprised by what Capcom has done with its latest beast. The final product is, in all honesty, remarkable, and it is even more obvious when the two titles are faced concurrently. Only one thing has been cut from the entire campaign, a single boss, in our opinion one of the least solid of the original, but the rest has been brought back in an evolved and modernized form, with everything that hasn't stood the test of time being completely reworked. Seriously, it may appear that some stages have been eliminated as the story progresses, but they are usually just recontextualized and appear in other parts of the story in an updated form. Not only that, but the game is jam-packed with goodies, including new combat, stage lengthening and beefing up, and new explorable regions. To give you an indication, finishing the original game today, again, took us just over 8 hours, whereas the remake took a solid 15. Given the high quality of Capcom games in recent years, we expected this remake to be excellent, but they really outdid themselves here. The extraordinary action sequences feature maps that are equivalent in variety and intellect to the best of the original game, but with battles that are properly calibrated around the many modifications to the gameplay. Even the few pages with true terror potential are more stressful and frightening, if what was portrayed wasn't enough. Capcom could not have changed the gameplay of Resident Evil 4 too much, given that it constitutes the backbone of the entire structure, and it would have been crazy to throw away what Mikami and his comrades have done. However, the remake is still a title remade from the ground up with the RE engine, which inevitably leads to it being based on a completely different physical system than the game on which it is based. The shooting here is similar to what was seen in the remakes of the second and third chapters, but with different aim and movement management. To clarify, in Mikami's Resident Evil 4, Leon could only shoot at a standstill, but his aim was generally more exact and swift. In the remake, Leon can move freely and even move, albeit slowly, while aiming at the opponent. It's a big advantage during battles because the enemies are so numerous and aggressive, but they tend to have rather phoned attacks and launch projectiles with predictable trajectories. Capcom partially counterbalanced this in two ways, by making the basic movement heavier and slower, though not by much, and by changing the power of weapons and all opponents' resistance. In short, the weapons in the remake don't have the same impact as the original, at least not until you correctly upgrade them from the game's renowned merchant, who, we can assure you, has even improved. As a result, the aiming system is similar to that of the other remakes, with a viewfinder whose accuracy reduces in direct proportion to how far you move, as well as a sharper differentiation between the various weapons. Even after the characteristics of the various guns have been improved, the resistance of the game's monstrosities tends to be significantly higher than in the past. With a few exceptions, the Ganados almost always require at least 2 shots to the legs to be thrown to the ground. If hit in the chest by low-potential weapons, their movements are not always interrupted, and they sometimes even resist 2 blows to the head. Whereas encounters have a comparable number of enemies to their attention, the renewed danger of the infected does not mean that Leon's brutal executions are not still an important part of the gameplay in this title. Indeed, due to a greater general scarcity of resources, the use of these maneuvers is likely to be even more important today. While in the original, using the knife strategically and eliminating groups of enemies with suplexes or roundhouse kicks, which inflict large amounts of damage, are invulnerable during the animation, and hit in an area, guaranteed an abundance of bullets. Capcom's current approach is that it's been returned to its survival horror roots, and it's now more important to conserve ammo, because it's easily purged from the inventory during some hectic fights or boss battles. Again, there appears to be adaptive difficulty, which evaluates the player's resources and changes the quantity and quality of the bullets scattered around the maps based on how many are used, but it has rarely happened to us to have so much lead available to feel safe, and the possibility is not enough to build projectiles with gunpowder found around to restore the situation to normal. It is very likely that the developers have decided to give Leon a powerful additional maneuver, which will be one of the main tools for those who want to avoid any waste, a very effective parry with the knife, allowing you to defend yourself against a variety of different attacks. This is a much more forgiving defensive mechanic than we expected. The window is wide, at least on normal difficulty, and it repels almost everything thrown at it, even parrying arrows and deflecting Molotov cocktails. If you parry it with the right timing a punch, Leon can also damage the Ganados by cutting off the limb cleanly. It may appear exaggeratedly powerful when described in this manner, but Capcom has balanced everything in the most natural way possible, that is, by giving the opponents various attacks from which you cannot defend yourself with knives, grappling, pushing, or simple blows normally unblockable and making all blades destructible. True, you can improve your main knife's resistance and repair it from a merchant, but given that it is spent after any action, including routine attacks, even if they are little, we can promise you that breaking nearly every additional knife found is not uncommon. To make it even more difficult to keep this tool intact, the designers decided to include a sort of variation on the theme of the Crimson Head introduced with the remake of the first Resident Evil. In practice, certain Ganados once killed begin to have convulsions, and if you don't finish them off with the knife, they reappear in an enhanced form with a broken neck and an enviable resistance to bullets. The requirement to carry out these coups de grace, combined with the introduction of new extremely dangerous executions that always make use of the sword, makes it extremely tough to abuse it. There's even a brand new stealth system, which helps in some situations if you clear the field of enemies by eliminating them from behind to avoid being surrounded later. Yet another fantastic implementation, so much so that some situations appear to have been inserted into the campaign on purpose to be addressed in this manner. The most welcome update, though, is the absence of QTEs. Relics of a bygone era and far too punitive in the original, they have been completely deleted here, along with a complete makeover of the phases that utilized them. Many of these events are usually replaced by the simple need to dodge, another useful maneuver that can save you a lot of damage if used correctly. The developers' decisions are all totally reasonable, and they repropose the same freedom of approach that makes Resident Evil for such a memorable video game. However, the new system has resulted in a less visceral feeling than the original game, in which the weapons were more devastating and a large part of the fun came from their ability to cause chaos. In short, we do not believe that the new gameplay is inferior to that of its predecessor, especially when we consider all of the reasons stated above and its great adaptation to conflicts, but we recognize how good the shooting quality was in Mikami's work. The only thing that disappointed us down was the complete absence of separate ways, the mini-campaign dedicated to Ada Wong. True, she was not there in the first edition of the game, but she was present in all subsequent versions and is regarded a vital element of the tale by nearly all fans. We were almost sure that we could use the most beloved femme fatale in the series for a few hours after what was done in the remake of the second chapter, and we can't deny that we were disappointed by the lack of chapters dedicated to her once the campaign was over. We can't be too harsh, as Leon's adventure has been almost doubled in this remake, but if these other materials had been included, we would have been presented with a near-perfect job, and it looks like a missed chance. It has, however, already been confirmed. This will still be included in a future free DLC, therefore we don't think it's fair to penalize what has been done for its absence. On the other hand, there's nothing to say about the technical side of things. The game has respectable graphics on PS5, where we played it, even when the performance mode is enabled, and displays fantastic attention to animations. Leon moves differently depending on his position during executions, has short bursts of fear if a bullet grazes him, gasps loudly if he has been running for a while, and the brutal dismemberments of enemies are no less, so much so that the tentacles of the last plaguers can still be seen moving from the severed limbs. Even the physics engine has improved as a result of the new technology. Enemies with large attack areas can literally tear their allies apart if they start landing blows in the middle of a group. Iron grips now work on Ganados, and two bullets can collide in flight and block each other. It is obviously still possible to stop them with a pistol shot, if you want. The amount of detail on the screen is also impressive, especially when you consider how much larger and more character-filled the Resident Evil 4 maps are than in previous chapters. It is pointless to elaborate on facial movements and the quality of faces and models. The RE engine is always a guarantee in this regard, and we have not encountered any stumbling blocks of any kind. Another positive aspect is the artificial intelligence, which is more sensitive than one might expect at first look. Many arenas in the remake have been modified to limit single abusable entry points for stabbing enemies to pieces, and the Ganados appear to take more complex paths, often bypassing Leon. It is still possible to exploit certain bottlenecks to easily eliminate them, but less frequently than before. Furthermore, the phases with Ashley are much more successful because of the simple ability to tell the girl to approach or move away on command, as well as the lack of a separate life bar. She is now simply incapacitated by blows and can be easily saved if she is hit again. Goodbye, dumpster diving. The sound design remains unchanged, and the frequent threats in Spanish from the Ganados not only allow you to perceive the position of the attackers much more clearly, which is quite beneficial if you chose to utilize stealth. The sound effects are expertly used to amplify the agony of certain situations, and they change realistically depending on where you are, but we don't want to go into too much detail to avoid spoiling some surprises, not to mention that the team's mastery in this type of operation is now more than consolidated.